well, we were talking about the socially constructed world, right? And sometimes these socially constructed worlds don't get along because they'll have preconceived notions that are unmanageable when they come into conflict, or they'll make communication impossible. And that's why we have what I've referred to as the schizophrenic state of American politics. Because right now, I mean, even I'm notorious for rejecting the notion of the left and the right, but it's a quick and easy way to talk about it. Even though that whole thought process is already just a reification of a two-party system. But the reason that it's gotten so ridiculous is that the people who are looking at the way that the left perceives the world and the way that the right perceive the world are given radically different tools for communication. They have different socially constructed realities.
True.
And the weirdest thing about all that, where the left and the right aren't speaking the same language anymore, is that combined, they're a minority. They are, though. Even combined, they're a minority. And that's worth taking into consideration because they're also the power structure politically in our country. And so that has a lot to do with the way that the individuals are seeing their reality. They see their reality differently and identify as people who are within the same shared sphere of influence.
And identities are socially constructed insofar as there are institutionalized apparatuses for the reproduction of various kinds of norms or practices. So we could say the Democratic establishment or the Republican establishment with the example that you were just given. Well, how do they function? It's by offering, it's by selling people identities, essentially. Like a sports, like sports sells people identities. Oh, well, I'm a Patriots fan, or whatever. So identification, is cultivated, right, by those things that oh, well, it's Coke or Pepsi. It's liberal or conservative. It's, and so you're given these kind of simplistic options, but by what? By institutions that benefit by you reproducing certain things for them.
Yeah, which is necessary. But as Foucault would point out, when we say necessary, we also mean you can't have a society or a civilization if something like that isn't happening to some extent, because there's always a center. No matter what you do, there's always going to be a center. You just have to be able to make sure that you can deal with a socially constructed reality that doesn't leave people out or that doesn't lead to injustices. But yeah, we decide, interpret, and agree upon the reality. And that's what gives the group that identifies with it that identity. Because otherwise you can't communicate an identity. How are you going to tell somebody who you are if you don't have anything to refer to? And so you even have nonconformists referring to themselves by breaking with the conformity and making themselves breaching experiments. And then cultures build around a similarity to people who behave in that manner, and you have South Park's Goth Kids, which is an excellent example of this sort of thing. The people who are rejecting the concept of a socially constructed world are appealing to a socially constructed world that denies the existence of the phenomena.
Say that one more time.
The people who are rejecting the social construction of reality are adhering to a socially constructed reality that sidesteps it.
And so people who deny the socially constructed, that race is socially constructed,
that gender is socially constructed, that law is socially constructed.
What are a few examples? Let's unpack that. A few examples of how the alt-right or the alt-centrists or whatever you want to call the misogynist edgy bros online, like how they do this. How do they appeal to a socially constructed narrative to try to refute social construction?
Dude, there's tons of stuff about that. The word that gets thrown around a lot is relative, like ethical relativism, which nobody believes.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: that is a straw person argument. No one in the world believes it or ever has believed it. No one, Derrida or anyone else, believes that every view is as good as every other view. That's only a view we discuss in freshman philosophy class in order to quickly refute it.
Even if somebody claimed that they thought that way, if they were in a situation, there are thought experiments to disprove it too. Like, if they thought that way, you would find an example of them saying somebody should be punished for thinking that something that they thought was right was actually wrong.
No,
So
it's just honestly, my experience with it is it's that kid in class who wants to talk and do the reading. That's the only fucking person in the world who will claim relativism as a cop-out for having to explain something that's somewhat complex.
Well, I think you're touching there on something else that I think might be more important to talk about anyway, which is this, barring the radicalism and everything else, there's a very normative rejection that takes place. And I remember one of the reasons I wanted to focus so much on language being socially constructed is because I had an experience at the College of Western Idaho where I brought up the notion of language being socially constructed. And everyone in the room was really uncomfortable with that notion. And the sociology professor was as surprised as I was that the room couldn't accept the notion that language was socially constructed.
Oh my God.
And I had to be like, look, where are you getting the idea that language is a fixed and permanent thing? And they're like, well, because language, the English language, this was mostly about the English language in particular. The English language exists, it's real, and we have rules about it. And I was like, what rules do you have for the English language? Where are you going to find those rules? And they're like, well, the rules exist and we're taught the rules. I was like, from whom? In Japan, in China, in France, there are actually government agencies that decide what the official language is and how it works. We deliberately do not have that. You can't even make that claim.
But I mean, we still have, Webster's and the Oxford dictionaries that are a really big deal, right?
And that immediately came up. Yeah, they said, well, there are dictionaries, and the dictionaries are written by. I was like, the dictionaries are written by people selling dictionaries.
Yeah.
Do we have a marketplace that decides our language? Is that the position that you have? And it's a bad position.
No, I find it really strange that was used to try to refute the socially constructed nature of, say, the English language, when I would think it was the exact opposite. Like, if it's a natural language, then why do you need a dictionary for it? Like, I don't know. You would.
Yeah. Well, and that's because here's the thing. I think that a lot of the thought process for this stuff isn't like, okay, so our choice is natural or man-made. Their thought process is, we need to be able to see our reality as objectively true, and we need to not have to question the things that make up the cornerstones of that reality. The American language has got rules they've been taught their entire lives not to break. They've been told since they were children how to use their commas, how to spell, how things are written, what order the letters appear in, and that this is correct. I can't tell you how much I've got in recordings from interviews doing ethnography or the Dungeons and Dragons observation of people saying, you're pronouncing something wrong. It's very difficult to make the claim that somebody's pronouncing something wrong in a country that has no basis for a standardized language, or that has no committee that decides it. I mean, that's not how these things are done. So there is no way for somebody to make the claim, but they do, and it's normal to do so. So when you step up and you say, actually, all of those things have no basis outside of people agreeing that children should be taught this way and that things should be pronounced this way, you're kicking the stool they're standing on out from under them. You're breaching their habitus. You're taking away the normativity of their life. This is what you have to go through as an individual on an individual level to start the journey we're all on now, is to have that begin when somebody comes along and kicks a stool out from under you and you realize that what you've been taking for granted is the reality you've lived in your entire life is made up of a lot of agreements by a lot of the people that you've known and doesn't necessarily have any objective grounding.
Right.
And if it did have objective grounding, God help us, because your very limited view of the world was going to be what the world was. That would be awful. Why are you in college if you already know everything?
I want to get a job. That's all I care about. All I
Yeah.
care about is a job, because I want to get a house, and then I have to have another house, and I got to have a boat and 3 cars, family, and that's it.
And it makes them miserable. It makes them miserable because nobody who lives like that is happy anyway. They'll go through a time and a half as many divorces, constantly be struggling with the incredible amounts of debt that they rack up now. Not that I'm not racking up incredible debt at the university.
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand why people want to why they have to dismiss the fact that it's that these things can be socially constructed. Like they're almost forgetting the authorship of human product. Like these are human products, and they're forgetting that they're human products along the way, like generationally, like such as language.
Yeah, Berger Lichtman actually talk about that. There's a section where they talk about how what goes on is individuals who are involved with coming up with a system are incredibly invested in that system, and it becomes a huge part of who and what they are. But as you get further and further removed from the people responsible for setting up the system to begin with, whether geographically or in the generations, that loses its meaning. And the rest of the group takes on other forms of constructed reality. But then some of the building blocks wind up with this, Adam and Eve primordial basis. And then it's in your language, even though you don't use it anymore. You still refer to things that aren't around, like a buttload, which does not mean what people think it means.
What does it mean?
It's a reference to a system of measurement we don't use anymore in our culture.
Oh my God, really?
Yes, some manner of gathering of bushels.
I've always thought it meant poop. A lot of it.
Like when they get the cell phone in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
A traditional unit of measurement for the volume of wines and alcoholic beverages, defined by 2 hogsheads, typically 36 gallons.
What? Defined by 2 hogsheads, and they use it to measure alcohol.
No, a hogshead is a measurement, like stone. See, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. You wind up with these weird things floating around in your language. And then later on, you describe something without having any reference to what this is. Your socially constructed reality is communicated using a language, making references to things that don't exist in your world anymore.
One of the most annoying ones, this one drives me absolutely crazy, is when people armchair etymologize, where there's a term and they go, oh, well, and then they basically they take the position of the person who's explaining, even though they're literally just speculating they're like, well, the word neo means new and liberal means not conservative, so it just means new liberal.
Oh.
Or like, what was the example we were just using? Buttload, right? So it's like, well, but we know what a butt is, and so what's a load? Well,
A lot of butt.
oh, actually, that sure beats poo. I mean, we're more a load of butts than
Tons of butts.
poop. By the way, we're getting some. And James is saying in the chat that what you're saying is so true. He says, I know because my education was mostly ACE Christian accelerated education. So as a result, it took me a decade to develop my scientific curiosity to the point where I could learn about such phenomenons and experiences my mind getting blown.
Yeah, we're getting a lot closer there too to postmodernism.
Point. And by the way, River Ransom just added that smokes are the best unit of measure, both distance and time. And I actually have used that in essays where I'm talking about phenomenology of time, because descriptively, time is not experienced as calendars. It's not experienced as clocks. And clocks and calendars are both units of measurement that are somewhat contingent, somewhat arbitrary, that become objective insofar as we agree on them, or all kind of share the use of them. But the thing is that there are other ways of seeing and experiencing time that are more valid depending on what we're talking about. And that one of the big things that comes into play here is the difference between the royal high modern science approach to language, which is a sort of universalized colonial, imperial project to get everyone on the same page, because that makes it easier to govern. or in to trade with, in the marketplace, versus parochial, local, indigenous knowledges and languages that are usually a lot more complex, but very specific to the region from which they originate.
Mhm.
And an example that James Scott uses at the end of Seeing Like a State is the when the colonizers were, in the Americas, using the almanacs or whatever to figure out when to plant corn. The when to plant corn specific to England or just wasn't true here. Whereas the natives were like, in this particular case, I don't know which tribe, were like, it's you plant the corn when the oak leaf is the size of a squirrel's ear. And this was actually genius because it actually varied by so within a state's radius, whether you're up on the mountain or down like in a lower plane, that remained a constant.
Yeah.
And actually true. And it might actually vary. It varied with temperature. It varied with so basically, like, you don't know when that week begins just by a calendar year because climate varies. That's just an example of local indigenous knowledge and specific kind of language that's very complex, that runs counter to an imperial project that's trying to get everyone on the same page to be governed or traded with.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And Berger and Luckman talk about how there are times when the reality that is composed by a group of individuals is reliant on survival in geographic areas, and you can see differences in those as well. Now, what's the most important part, I think, about language is that the way that we view reality is contingent upon the way that we're taught to think about it, which is linguistic. And the way that our language forms, vice versa, is the same. So you wind up with very different concepts of a socially constructed reality from people who have studied a variety of languages as compared to somebody who's only familiar with their own. One of the biggest issues with this too is that people who haven't studied any language outside of the one that they know have a tendency to presuppose that anything that they think or say can be directly translated in another language, or that the things that are communicated to them as translations of other language are exact translations of what they would say. They just sound different, which is so radically wrong. You have a friend who's written about this recently, right, about translating Urdu, which is, I imagine, extremely difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, he did the American translation of Urdu's forms of capital. It's a fantastic thing that I've shared if you go to my community tab on my channel. But yeah.
I mentioned Purdue, and I brought up habitus,
right,
which is another important part of this too, because we have a tendency to be programs to get by, right? We sort of know how to do things in our corner of the world. And if you don't know that the way that things are done in other corners of the world, I mean, there's a lot of just like little nuance that gets missed out in there. There's a lot of fine print to the lifestyles that we lead in these little pockets that never winds up being discussed. And when that happens, and that never comes out, you of course wind up with incongruities between different groups. The problems with ignoring that, the concept of just being like, nah, if you pull hard enough on your bootstraps, of course you're going to wind up with things like that the preconception of a one size fits all reality, and then it does get imposed by leadership, and then you do end up with things like colonialism, and you do end up with people not listening when minorities get shunted to the side because the socially constructed mass culture doesn't include them, and doesn't leave space for them, and you can't even talk about it because you don't have the tools to do it.
Yeah. Yep.